It's time for the Property Podcast, where every week tens of thousands of property investors, new and experienced, join together to get news, knowledge and laughs at our expense. With me, Rob Bence.
And me, Rob Dix. Join us every Thursday morning for your weekly dose of property ideas and motivation. Then head over to our website at thepropertypodcast.com to keep the conversation going. Now though, let's get started.
Welcome to the Property Podcast. It's episode 24. I'm Rob Bent, and with me, as always, is Rob Dix. Hi, Rob. How are you?
Hello, Rob. Really well, thank you. Another Thursday morning, another episode, and a really exciting one. This one is called Inflation, Your Best Friend or Your Worst Enemy. And I think this is a really interesting subject because it has a really big effect on new property investments, but it happens so slowly that that effect often gets ignored. So we're going to be putting that right today by telling you everything you need to know about inflation. Also, in the news, Sarah Beanie is displeased, which obviously is the week's biggest story for us. And also related to property development, our resource of the week is a new site that could make it a little bit easier for you to find development projects of your own. That's all coming up.
Fantastic. But before we get into the detail, we want to thank our fantastic listeners who leave reviews. And this week, our reviews are coming from Robin. He says, I just started to get into property investment and the knowledge these guys share is just what I was looking for. Really useful and essential. Love it. Andy says, great podcast. Read most books about property investing. This podcast is another great way to get more information. Keep it up, guys. Highly recommend it. And Silvo says, I'm hooked. I've listened to the whole series in a couple of weeks and I went back and listened to a few episodes again, making notes and signed up to the Property Geek podcast as well. I've read a few of the recommended books and installed the apps too. Great work. Thanks for your efforts. Well, thank you very much, everyone. They're fantastic reviews. And if you haven't left a review yet, get yourself over to iTunes because it makes a huge difference and you can see how much we love the people who do.
Absolutely. We're pushing for 100. We really want to get there soon. So please do leave a review if you haven't already. Rob, what have you been up to this week?
Busy week, Rob. Really good. One of the highlights was meeting up with Nick and Mark from Homeshore over the weekend. I was back in Merseyside and met with them on the Wirral. Actually, Nick from Homeshore left one of our first reviews really early on, if you go back and have a look. And Ed from the Self-Help podcast is a bit of a networker and put us in touch because Ed does a lot of work for me at the RMP. But he also knows these guys. Anyway, they run a lettings agent, an estate agent. They do a bit of property investments as well. So they've really got their fingers in a lot of pies and they're doing some really interesting stuff, bringing out the US model of estate agents over to the UK. Nothing really to add except have a look at their website, what they're up to. They're really good guys, but it's just nice to meet more like-minded individuals and speak with people who are trying to do good things in the property industry. Because as we've mentioned before, Rob, there's plenty of sharks out there. So it's nice to meet some genuine, good people who are making a difference.
I've been speaking to a lot of estate agents this past week, which has been an interesting experience, a mixed bag. The good ones can really easily shine because there are so many just plain not very good ones. And as you say, some people who are total sharks. So it's nice to be meeting good people. And on the subject of meeting good people, if you're listening to this on the day that the podcast comes out, our meetup is tonight. If you've not committed to coming along yet, you might just about have time. If you're listening nice and early to this, it's in London, 6 o'clock tonight, although not really tonight because we record this in a weird space-time continuum kind of thing. But it's tonight if you're listening. That's the important thing. Also, I wanted to give a shout out to Sam from the blog What Sam Saw Today. She's got a really great blog about properties to buy at auction. And I've been chatting to her because she's got a book coming out next year. I've got another book coming out, so we've been having a bit of an author-to-author chat, so that's been nice. So it seems like we've both been busy nattering away to people this week.
Yep, no, it's been good. And as you said, networking is so important, so that's why this event is fantastic. So we're really looking forward to a laid-back meetup tonight. So if you're keen and you download on day one, then get along. We'll see you tonight. Okay, Rob, let's get into news. Whenever Sarah Beanie talks, we listen.
We do.
And she's a bit annoyed this week.
She is. I mentioned in my book, actually, I was talking about her as I do a lot. I was saying, I don't know how she managed to hold back when she was talking to all these people on Property Ladder and she was giving them really solid advice about what they should do. And they just completely ignored her. It's like, what? She must have been thinking, what is the point of me being here? And then the really annoying thing was that they normally went on to make a load of money anyway because the market was going up so quickly in those days. And so the news is that she has confessed that she did get really annoyed with people who ignores her property advice. So it's good to hear that she might have the patience of a saint, but even she can be pushed. And she's got a new show coming out, I think it's this week, or it might have already started, I'm not sure. But she's got a new show coming out, which I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that as well. That will be recorded on Series Link. I don't blame her, Rob. It's funny because it's not like she knocked on these people's door at random and started pushing her advice on them. They asked her to come into their homes and advise them. So what's the point in getting her involved if you're not going to listen to her? It was really crazy. And it wasn't just like it happened once or twice. It seemed like it was every week.
I know.
Bananas.
But it's good to hear that she was thinking what we were all thinking as well. I hope the people on a new series are going to pay her a bit more attention, because it's not as easy now as it was back then to make every mistake under the sun and still make money at the end of it.
Well, let's get into our topic of the week, Rob, because first of all, anyone who's listening to this, well done, because inflation for some people will be a turn-off. However, this is one of the most important aspects of property investment, but one of the least talked about. I'm really excited that we get to talk about inflation. It's one of the things I talk about before anything else when I meet investors at R&P Property, because if they understand inflation and how it can make you wealthier or make you poorer, it really is a topic you should understand if you want to create wealth. So, Rob, let's get going.
Let's do that. Now, confession, first of all, is you said it doesn't get talked about as much as it should do, and I have to confess that to brush up for this episode, I actually had to listen to our friend Pete Matthew and his Meaningful Money podcast. His episode 15 was called Inflation Explained. It's a really good podcast. It's a really nice, simple explanation. He doesn't relate it to property, obviously, but it's a really good explanation of what inflation is. And I felt like I needed to listen to that because, I've obviously got a sense of what inflation is, but it's just not something that I think about that much. And in fact, we should be thinking about it a whole lot more with any kind of long-term financial planning, because the value of a pound isn't going to be the same in even 3 years' time as it is from now. And with property, we're often making investments that we could be holding for 30 years. So it's something really, really important. I'm glad that you say that you talk about it first in all your meetings, because that means that you should be able to give a nice, simple explanation of it better than I can.
Well, actually, I'm going to steal Pete Matthews' example. Because his podcast is great. It's, gives you the general overview of inflation, and what we're going to do is related to property. You're going to get benefit from listening to both. But he went on Wikipedia, and I had a look around to see if I could find a better, simple, one-liner explanation. But actually, it nails it. And it says, in economics, inflation is a rise in the general level of prices, goods and services in the economy over a period of time. So inflation is just the goods we buy every day or the services we use every day increasing in price over time. That's inflation. Really simple. So let me give you a real life example of how inflation is at work all the time. I'm going to use the analogy of buying a pint of milk. Let's say we went in a time machine and 10 years ago we walked into a local newsagent's and we had 25 pence in our pocket. We could go into that newsagent's and buy a pint of milk. Now let's say on that day we didn't buy the pint of milk and we kept that 25 pence in our pocket, and we fast forwarded 10 years back to today and we took that 25 pence into the same newsagents and wanted to buy that pint of milk. They'd laugh at you, because although the money is physically the same, its value has decreased over time because of inflation, and the pint of milk today is more like 50 pence. The physical number is the same, the physical currency you have is the same, but the value of it is less, and that's caused by inflation. So once you get your head around that, the rest of what we're going to talk about will start to fit into place.
True story. I found £1.55 down the side of the sofa over the weekend, and I was pretty chuffed about that. But the point at which that £1.50 was lost, it could have been worth even more. You could have bought all sorts of stuff with it. As it is, I can probably get 3 pints of milk according to your maths. I don't tend to drink milk, so I don't know. But
if you had found that 20 years ago, Rob, you could have bought a brand new BMW.
Exactly. So yes, search down the sofa early is the lesson we can take from this. That sums it up really. And I think the thing that we're going to take forward into this episode is that the exact same principle applies to property as well as milk or change down the side of your sofa. So in the case of property, I think you can look at the reported rises in property prices over time and use that to realise what an important effect inflation has. For example, according to the Halifax, since 1983, house prices have risen by 428%, which is pretty massive. But then that is in just kind of nominal terms. That's not taking into account inflation. If you actually factor in the inflation that there's been since 1983, that means that in real terms, property is only up 101%, which is still pretty big, but it's not as big as the 428%. So when we're talking about property prices, we have to keep inflation in mind. And just this past week, I read a really interesting piece of analysis that really applies this to house price debate right now. And this analysis is from Richard Brown, who I think is a listener. I certainly follow him on Twitter, and I'll link to his Twitter handle because I thought this is a really good piece of analysis by him. But he said that you're always reading in the papers at the moment about how house prices are going up and the market's being talked up in a big way. And the UK house price index is up by 3.1% apparently in the last year. But then if you look at the RPI measure of inflation, that's also up 3.1% in the last year or thereabouts. So if all this this data is accurate, and I don't really know if it is or not, that means that house prices have actually stayed flat. And then in the same period of time, London prices are actually up 8%. So if London prices are up 8% and everything else is up 3%, that means on average, everything outside London must have actually gone up by less than 3.1%, which is the rate of inflation. And therefore, if you believe all that, then house prices outside London have fallen in the last year. I don't know how accurate that data is. I'm not trying to make any great extrapolations from it. It's just that once you take inflation into account, it can really turn a story on its head, and you have to remember what's going on, even over this short period of time, a year. But if you're talking over a long period of time, inflation's going to have an even bigger effect, obviously.
It definitely does. I mean, we talked about in one of our early episodes how prices over the last 4 or 5 years have fallen by quite a big percentage. It was over 20% in real terms. And real terms basically means taking into account inflation. I think that's really interesting. And this is a positive thing because if you look back, you'll see property is an inflation-beating asset. That's what a lot of this is about. You want an asset that's going to beat inflation, in terms of its growth and value. That's what we're going to go into more detail. But before we do, I think it's important to understand, what causes inflation. Now, there are many things that cause inflation, but for me, the big one is printing money. You may hear that being called quantitative easing. You can call it what you want, but it's effectively money being created. Now, we used to be part of something called the gold standard. The gold standard came in after the Second World War. And what the gold standard was a simple method of controlling the amount of currency in the system. So if you wanted to print or create a certain amount of currency, you had to have the equivalent gold reserves in the bank. So if a government wanted to suddenly create 5 nuclear power stations and they're really expensive, they could cheat their way to getting the money by printing a load of money. They couldn't do that at the time when gold standard was in place. What government started to do was water down the ratios of the amount of physical gold, the amount of currency that you needed to have. And in 1971, President Nixon removed what was left of the gold standard altogether. So what that meant was from 1970 onwards, because the dollar is the world's currency, countries could start to print money as and when they wanted. Now, when you have a lot of something, the value of it decreases. So let me give you an example. If you're listening to this on your iPod, for example, if you're listening to an iPod, yours was one of 10 iPods in the world because all the others, for some reason, had stopped working and they were no longer on sale, then they would be worth an awful lot more money than what you've bought them for now. But the reason why it's only worth a few £100s is because there's plenty of them. Okay, so when the supply of something is reduced, the value goes up. But the opposite works as well. When a lot of something is created, the value is decreased. So let's just say, Apple decided to give away 1 billion iPods tomorrow. The value of iPods would decrease rapidly because people would start putting them on the market and there's a lot of them. The point I'm making is if the governments print a lot of cash, the value of it decreases. So that creates inflation. A little bit deep there, but if you understand that, then you really understand the whole concept of inflation in full.
Yeah, so now we understand what inflation is and a little bit about how it relates to property and where it comes from. Let's look at how inflation affects us. The title of this episode is Your Worst Enemy or Your Best Friend. And the answer to that question is it depends whether you're saving or whether you've got debt. If you are a saver, you are punished by inflation. So this is pretty simple to understand. So if you've got a savings account right now, you're probably lucky to get about 2% or something on that in instant access account. So if you get 2% and inflation is 3%, then that means you're actually getting poorer every year. Because even though your money's sitting there and then every month or every year or whatever, you'll see an interest payment drop in, you're not seeing the inflation that's happening. And if the inflation is higher than the interest rate you're getting poorer. It's the same thing in a pension. So if you've got a pension, which is earning you 4%, you're being charged by the financial institution 1.5%, and inflation is 3%, you're losing 0.5%. But by contrast, property tends to at least keep pace with inflation over the long term. And as well as that, it actually generates a return while you hold it in terms of the profit you make each month on your rent over your mortgage and other expenses. So property, in terms of inflation, is a better store of wealth than cash or a pension because it tends, over the long term, with lots of peaks and troughs along the way, to go up at least in line with inflation. So your wealth is not being eroded by that effect.
It's important to understand how you're being punished each year if you just leave your money in the bank, okay? If you're leaving money in the bank, you're not making money. So we look back at the data before, since 1983, in real terms, property's grown by 100% if you account for inflation. If you'd left your money in the bank over the same period, you would have lost money. You would have made a loss because inflation has outgrown the average savings rate since then. That's pretty scary, but true. And it's funny because people do what we've been told over time, put money in the bank, save up, put money in a pension, save up. But if pensions are paying 4%, charging 1.5%, inflation's at 3%, you're losing 0.5% each year. It's the silent thief. That's what I often referred to inflation as the silent thief. It's taking money from you away each year. But as Rob's already said, it can reward as well. And it rewards people with debt. And that's good debt. So I'm not talking about buying a car, which is a liability, with a loan. That's not a good debt. A good debt is buying an asset that pays you each month, okay? And that could be a buy-to-let, for example. So how does it reward people with debt? Well, we've already said that inflation devalues currency, but inflation also devalues debt. So let's go back in time again. Let's say we had a buy-to-let that 10 years ago was worth 50,000 and it had an interest-only mortgage of 25,000 on the property. So if you could get an interest-only mortgage 10 years ago at 25,000, today it would still be 25,000 and a property might be worth 100. That 25,000 in real terms has devalued because 10 years ago, what that 25,000 may have seemed like a lot of money, today may still seem like a lot of money, but it's actually worth a lot less. For example, 10 years ago, that 25,000 may have bought a brand new top-of-the-range Jaguar. Today, it may buy you an entry-level BMW, a new entry-level BMW. So the point I'm making is the number is the same, but the value of it is less. So your debt is worth less in real terms than it was 10 years ago. So inflation is eroding that debt over time. We talked about mortgages last week, and I made the point that we were going to cover this inflation this week. And it's one of the important things to understand why interest-only mortgages are so appealing, because you earn that better cash flow over time in the short term, but over the long term, your debt is being devalued by inflation as well. You've got a choice here. You can decide to put your money in assets that punish you because of inflation, so they're not really assets, or you can put your money into assets that are rewarded by inflation. It's your choice. I know this is a little deeper concept than we've talked about previously, but it's so important to understand because if you understand how inflation can actually help you become wealthier and how it's making most people poorer, then you're on the first steps to creating real wealth in the future. So it's really powerful to understand.
My parents always used to say things like, our first mortgage was £7,000, which today sounds like absolutely nothing. Back then it was a lot of money. But if they'd had an interest-only mortgage and they kept that, their house would now be worth dramatically more than it was when they bought it. And their mortgage would still be £7,000, which is nothing. So you can see how over a long time frame it makes a really big difference. And so that's why we talked about leverage recently. And leverage really does help you in that respect. Like you might feel more comfortable if you're paying it off every month, if you're on a repayment mortgage. But in fact, if you understand inflation and you realize that the value of that is actually being eroded over time anyway, you might find that it's better to use that in your favor. That comes back to the point about good debt and bad debt. There are some debts which are definitely bad, but mortgage debt, if you manage it correctly, can actually be a tool to help make you more wealthy.
And now it's conspiracy time. Some people like conspiracy theories, so here's one that's bounded around. The government is letting inflation run away a little because it needs to. And if you're someone who follows, economics more than average, okay, someone who likes to read into these things, this won't come as a shock to you. But the government is allowing inflation to run away for a reason. And that's because at the moment, there's a lot of austerity measures just to break even, to balance the books with the government debt. So not to bring it down, but just so it doesn't increase any further. I mean, we've had some real years of pain, a lot of cuts, a lot of sacrifices, and that's just to stop increasing the debt, just to get it level. Now, how on earth would the government then start to pay the debt down? Realistically, they can't. Now, don't worry, don't start crying. It's not that bad. What they're going to do is they're going to allow the debt to be eroded by inflation. So the debt may not actually, the number decrease, but over years, the value of it will, because tax returns will increase over time, wages will increase over time, GDP will increase over time. The debt may not go down, but the value of it in real terms will. Now, the government doesn't come out and openly say this because I don't think any government will be in power for long if they said, yes, we're going to allow the services and goods to go up in value and we're comfortable with that, because that means in the short term, we're all feeling the pain. So no government is going to come out and say it. But this is not the first time it's happened. After the Second World War, America and the UK did this. They allowed inflation to go up to decrease the debt. That's what they did. They got rid of the war debt by allowing inflation to run away. It's what's happening now. If the government is openly going to do this, and they've not said it, this is just my opinion, but I think a lot of people would back me up on this one. If the government is going to allow inflation to run away, what are you going to do? What side of the fence are you going to pick? Are you going to pick the side to put your money in assets that are going to be eroded in real terms, your wealth? Or are you going to put your money in assets that's going to have the debt eroded over time? The choice is yours. The rules may not be fair, but you've got the choice to make on which side of the fence you jump on.
I think that's a really great summary. It might not sound fair that the government can use inflation as a tool and erode their debt in that way, but if you're in a position to do the same, then why not? It's not fair that if you sit and you prudently put all your money in the savings account, or you just leave it under the mattress or something, that you're going to get poorer, but that's the way it is. And the important thing is to understand that all this stuff is going on, and you can then make the best decisions to affect you. And if you're not thinking about inflation as part of your plans, then you're really missing out a big piece of the puzzle. It's a very quiet and subtle influence, but it's a really big one, so it's something that you've got to take into account. Well done for sticking with us through this topic that in theory should have been very boring, but hopefully we've made it interesting enough, and hopefully if you weren't thinking about inflation much before, you will be now.
Hopefully. But if you fast forward to this point, all you need to know is property is an inflation-beaten asset, and the debt you have on it will erode over time.
Well, you could have just said that to start with. That would have saved us about 15 minutes.
Yeah, but we have to block out 30, so
That's true.
we all just ended up talking about ourselves. Right, Rob, we've got a resource of the week, and you've come to the rescue because you've been draining me recently of all my resources, but you've stepped up to the plate and you've delivered an absolute belter.
Yeah, you've been really keeping this afloat for the last little while, so I figured it was time that I stepped in, and I think I've got a good one. This one is a website, and it's called propertytorenovate.co.uk. We're going to link to it in the show notes. In fact, we're going to link to everything we've talked about in the show notes, including a few of the articles with the figures that we've talked about throughout this episode. But Property to Renovate is a really interesting site. What it basically does is it trawls through all the listings on Zoopla, and it pulls out just the properties that seem to have development potential. This isn't done manually because there's vast amounts of data. What it does is it analyses the language that's used in each listing. Estate agents tend to say things like in need of updating when things are a total mess, or they'll say that things have got scope for extension. And so what it does is it will go through all the hundreds of thousands of listings on there and pull out things that match these criteria. And then you can take those listings and filter them by location, keyword, price. There's even a box you can tick where you can just see auction properties. So it's really clever. It means if you're looking for a property that you can do a bit of work to increase its value, rather than just kind of looking through the area and trying to look at each listing individually or look at the photos and try and figure out what the state of it is, you can just do that completely automatically. So it immediately strips out everything you're not interested in and leaves you with just the stuff that you are. I've had a little bit of a play with it. You get the odd kind of erroneous result because it is done automatically, not manually, so that's going to happen, but it still saves you a whole lot of time. So it's well worth a look if you're in the market for a renovation project.
Fantastic. Rob, I don't know why you've been keeping so quiet over these last few weeks. That's an absolute belter of a resource. I think you should do next week as well.
Okay, I'll do next week. I feel bad though, because I can't remember where I stole that from. I read about that somewhere and thought, oh, that'd make a great resource, but I can't remember where it was. I will credit whoever it was in the show notes if I manage to find it, but otherwise, sorry if I've stolen your find, but I think it's a good one. It deserves to be shared.
Well, that's us for another week, Rob, but we need to let everyone know about the special number 25 episode next week.
I think we've been fairly open in crediting how much we've been influenced in this podcast by Dan and Ian from formerly the Lifestyle Business Podcast, now called the Tropical MBA Podcast. They've been big mentors of ours, whether they know it or not. So episode number 40 of their Tropical MBA podcast is about dreamlines. And this is a concept that Tim Ferriss of the 4-Hour Workweek first came up with. It kind of links into planning your goals and working out where you want to be in the future. So we're going to take that and riff on it in an episode that we're going to call How to Create Your Property Dreamline. If you want to listen to the Tropical MBA in preparation and find out what the concept of dreamlining is about, we're going to link to that in the show notes. You don't have to do that. You can just tune in and we'll explain explain everything for you next week.
I'm really looking forward to that. As Rob said, we are huge fans. We love that podcast over any other, including our own. So it's going to be a really good episode, and I hope you enjoy it. As we mentioned at the start of the show, if you are listening to this today on Thursday the 29th, then get along to King's Cross tonight if you can. We'd love to see you. Go to the Property Podcast /meetup. propertypodcast.com/meetup. And we are very close to review 100. So please, if you've not left a review yet, get online and do that, because Rob and I will probably pop a cork of cheap champagne and maybe Carver when that happens, because, it's a real milestone and we're really, really chuffed about how far this has gone. So thank you. And on that note, enjoy your weeks, everyone. We'll speak with you the same time next week.
Thanks for listening to the Property Podcast. Make sure you join our mailing list at thepropertypodcast.com.
And remember, we love 5-star reviews. Rob even loves them more than air miles.